August 1945. The air above the Pacific shimmered with heat, and the women inside a small Japanese POW camp near Kyushu could already tell the sound of American engines from miles away. That deep metallic roar meant one thing: bombs. Every time the sirens screamed, they ran to the ditches, clutching their ration tins, hearts pounding. They had survived air raids before, the flash of light and the shock wave that made even the ground tremble. But this time, something felt different. When the first B-29s appeared, the sky didn't explode. It whispered. The planes came lower, slower, as if hesitant. Prisoners squinted up through sheets of sunlight, waiting for the whistle of falling death. Instead, tiny silver shapes began drifting down. Dozens. Then, hundreds. The camp froze. What fell from the sky wasn't fire. It was paper. The first sheet hit the dirt near the latrine. Another landed on the laundry line. Women screamed and ducked as if shrapnel might follow. One guard shouted, "Don't touch it! It's poison!" Another fired a warning shot at the air, as though bullets could stop the fluttering rain. The leaflets fell silently, catching on the barbed wire, sticking to roofs, sliding through puddles. In that eerie moment, the only sound was paper rustling against corrugated tin. For the prisoners, that silence was worse than any bomb. In their minds, Americans were demons, ruthless, merciless, capable of anything. So why had they dropped something harmless? Some thought the paper might carry invisible gas. Others whispered it contained curses or secret messages meant to drive them insane. Fear spread faster than the wind. There were 66 confirmed POW camps like this one across the Pacific. Reports indicate that millions of these mysterious leaflets were scattered over Japan in the final weeks of the war. To the women crouched in mud, none of that mattered. All they knew was that something unthinkable had just happened. The enemy had chosen not to kill them. And as the paper snow settled, one guard, pale and trembling, barked new orders: collect every leaflet, destroy them before anyone reads. But curiosity, once born, is harder to silence than fear. Because inside one of those drifting sheets lay a message powerful enough to break an empire's silence. The leaflets lay everywhere, on rice sacks, in puddles, caught in fence wire like trapped birds. But no one moved. For the first time in months, the camp was silent enough to hear insects buzzing over the latrines. The guards barked in panic, ordering everyone to stay inside the barracks. Their voices cracked with something new. Not authority, but fear. The women crouched behind bamboo walls, eyes wide, lungs tight. No one dared to breathe too loudly. "Don't touch it!" shouted one sergeant again, rifle trembling in his hands. "It's American trickery." The camp commandant stormed across the yard, snatching up a leaflet with gloved fingers. He turned it over, staring as though it might explode. Then he cursed, crushed it in his fist, and shoved it into his tunic. "Burn them all," he ordered. The women could smell his sweat even from 10 paces away. Inside the dim barracks, whispers flickered like candlelight. "Maybe it's poison," said one nurse. "No," another murmured. "Maybe it's surrender notice. Maybe the war is ending." Their words trembled between hope and terror. For years, they'd been told that Americans would kill them on sight. That capture meant dishonor worse than death. Yet now, the enemy had chosen to drop paper instead of fire. No one understood the psychology at play. Allied units had switched tactics, bombing less, leafleting more, as the war edged toward its final act. Over 10 million leaflets, historians later noted, fluttered across Japan in those months. But to these women, crouched in filth and fear, the numbers meant nothing. Their world was shrinking to the size of a single printed page no one dared to read. Even the guards, once fierce, seemed unsure of their own rules. A corporal kicked a pile of leaflets, shouting, "Don't look! Eyes down!" But when he turned away, one girl couldn't resist. She reached through the slats, fingers brushing a wet page that clung to her skin like breath. In that instant, the entire camp seemed to stop breathing. Every gaze turned toward her, waiting for her to fall, to convulse, to burn. But she didn't. The leaflet didn't kill her. It whispered something else entirely. Tomorrow, when she finally read the words, the truth printed on that fragile sheet would begin to unravel everything they'd been taught to believe. The next morning, dawn came pale and heavy, fog curling around the barbed wire like breath. The woman who had touched the leaflet, Private Aiko Nakamura, sat alone beside the fence. The paper had dried overnight, its ink smudged but readable. She hesitated, her pulse beating in her fingertips. For years, she'd been told that American words were poison, but something about this thin, ordinary sheet called to her curiosity. She unfolded it. No skulls, no threats, just neat English text and small Japanese translations printed below. This war is over. Surrender, and you will be treated well. Food and safety will be given. Do not die for nothing. Aiko blinked, unsure if she was dreaming. The leaflet didn't demand loyalty or vengeance, it offered mercy. For a long moment, she just stared at the paper, the way a starving person stares at food. Behind her, whispers spread as others crept closer. They had expected orders for destruction, not peace. They are lying, muttered one guard. It's propaganda. Yet his voice shook. He snatched the leaflet from Aiko's hand and read it himself, eyes darting faster, lips moving silently. He looked smaller when he finished. Reports indicate that U.S. psychological warfare units had carefully crafted these messages under what they called Operation Starvation. Their mission was to end the war by persuasion rather than annihilation. Leaflets like these were dropped before every major attack, sometimes hours, sometimes days ahead, to warn civilians to evacuate. But to POWs like Aiko, this was unthinkable. The enemy telling them to live. Around the campfire that night, she repeated the words she remembered. They said, "Don't die for nothing." The others listened, torn between fear and the aching need to believe. Somewhere deep inside, something began to crack. The certainty that Japan could still win. But mercy, in wartime, was dangerous knowledge. When the commander discovered that not all leaflets had been destroyed, his rage ignited faster than any bomb. He ordered every scrap of paper burned at once. The women watched the fire swallow the words that had promised them life, embers swirling into the night sky like lost prayers. What he didn't know was that not every leaflet made it to the flames. Some were hidden beneath sleeping mats, waiting to speak again in the dark. Night swallowed the camp in uneasy silence, broken only by the crackle of burning paper. The commandant stood before the fire pit, his boots sunk into the mud, watching the leaflets curl and blacken. Flames hissed as wet ink turned to smoke, carrying the forbidden words into the humid air. "No one keeps a single scrap," he barked, voice hoarse. The guards saluted, forcing the prisoners to line up and watch the destruction. Fear was supposed to keep them obedient. Instead, it lit something else: curiosity. The women stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes flicking between the fire and the shadows. Each page that burned seemed to take a piece of their old certainty with it. Aiko Nakamura felt the warmth on her face and thought about the promise she'd read. "You will be treated well." That phrase looped in her mind like a prayer she didn't yet understand. When no one looked, she brushed her foot over the dirt and slipped a half-burnt leaflet beneath the hem of her skirt. The ash left faint streaks on her palms, gray as guilt. By then, rumors had already spread across other camps. Some prisoners had refused to burn their papers. Others had been executed for keeping them. Imperial Army directives had made it clear: anyone found in possession of enemy propaganda will be shot. To read was treason, one survivor later said. Yet knowledge was harder to kill than flesh. That night, after lights out, A faint glow flickered inside the women's barracks. Someone had stolen a candle from the kitchen, shielding it with a tin cup. The flame trembled as Aiko unfolded her hidden paper once more. Around her, faces gathered, hollow-eyed, half-starved, desperate for meaning. The words seemed to breathe in the flickering light, promising something none of them had dared imagine: a life beyond the wire. Outside, guards paced with rifles, unaware that in one cramped hut, faith in the Empire was quietly dying. The fire in the yard had turned to embers, but a new one, small, invisible, defiant, was spreading through whispers. "If they wanted us dead," Aiko whispered, "they would have sent bombs." No one answered, but heads nodded. By morning, the camp's ashes would cool, and in the stillness that followed, those secret words would ignite a different kind of fear. The fear of truth. Dawn came gray and wet, the air thick with the smell of ash. In the yard, the last fires had died, leaving only piles of paper ghosts. Half-burnt leaflets fused to the dirt like scars. Aiko knelt beside one, brushing the soot away. Her fingers trembled. Beneath the charred edges, a single line remained legible in Japanese. "Evacuate immediately. The next target may be Tokyo or Nagasaki." She froze. Those words pulsed through her veins like ice. The Americans weren't bluffing. The war was ending in fire, just not the kind they expected. When she whispered it to the others, a ripple of panic moved through the barracks. Tokyo? Nagasaki? Their homes? The women pressed their hands over their mouths as though silence could undo what they'd heard. By that morning, rumors had already slithered into the camp. Hiroshima had been erased. Some said it was a new kind of bomb, brighter than the sun, that melted shadows into walls. Others insisted it was propaganda. No one knew for sure, only that the Empire's silence had become deafening. Reports indicate that by mid-August, over 200,000 civilians had died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But to these women, it wasn't statistics. It was family. It was everything they had left burning away in a single flash. That afternoon, the sound of engines returned. Everyone ducked instinctively, hearts in throats. But again, no bombs fell. Only more paper. The sky looked almost merciful, white pages fluttering down like surrender flags. Some landed gently on the roofs. Others swirled through open windows. The guards didn't even try to collect them this time. Their eyes were hollow, their voices low. The empire they served was vanishing, and the proof was raining from the sky. Aiko clutched one leaflet to her chest. The same sentence appeared in bolder ink now. "The war is lost. Save yourselves." Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of truth finally finding her. Around her, the camp stood still, time suspended between denial and revelation. By sundown, the women sat in silence, staring at the papers spread across the dirt. Above them, another faint drone echoed in the distance. More planes, more messages, another round of impossible mercy. The next morning, the sky over Kyushu filled once again with the hum of distant engines. But this time, the rhythm was almost gentle. The women watched from behind the fence, expecting thunder and flame. Instead, another wave of leaflets spiraled downward, spinning like silver fish through the light. The guards didn't shout now. They only stared. Whatever orders once existed had melted with Japan's defenses. Even the officers seemed unsure which war they were still fighting. Just months earlier, these same aircraft, B-29 superfortresses, had been the engines of apocalypse. Each one could carry 10 tons of bombs, capable of erasing a city block in seconds. But in late July, American command had shifted gears. Operation Black Thunder had turned from destruction to persuasion. The air crews, once trained to unleash fire, were now loaded with words. Tons of them. The psychological warfare teams in Saipan and Guam worked around the clock, printing 10,000 sheets per minute. Each leaflet cost barely a cent, 1/20th the price of a bomb, and reached thousands more minds. Aiko watched the papers float down like a broken snowfall. She wondered what it must feel like to be in those planes, to choose paper over steel. Somewhere above, American crewmen were counting the success not in kills, but in hearts shaken. When one leaflet landed near her feet, she picked it up instinctively. This one was different. Bright white, sharp print, with a map showing Japan's remaining cities, and the bold message, "Surrender now. We will not bomb again if peace is declared." The simplicity felt unreal. She traced the edges, thinking of her brothers who had died believing surrender was shame. Now the enemy itself was offering a path home. Nearby, a sergeant kneeled to read the paper too. His hand shook, not with rage but exhaustion. "Even mercy sounds mechanical," he muttered, glancing at the silver planes vanishing into cloud. The camp's food bins were nearly empty, the guards thinner every day. Industrial Japan had been starved from the skies. Railroads shattered, fuel gone, cities flattened. The only abundance left was paper. As the last leaflet touched the mud, Aiko realized the bombing had truly ended. But what followed silence was something hungrier, something that would test whether survival meant life or just waiting to die. By late August, the camp had begun to starve. The women no longer talked much. Their voices were brittle from hunger. Bowls of watery rice gruel were rationed once a day, sometimes stretched with weeds or ground shells. Aiko counted each grain as if it were a heartbeat. The guards were no better. Uniforms sagging, eyes hollow, rifles carried like burdens instead of weapons. The empire that once demanded sacrifice had nothing left to feed its believers. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Aiko sat near the empty rice barrel at the edge of camp. The wood smelled sour from mold. A single leaflet lay pinned under a pebble beside it, half torn but legible. She picked it up. The headline read, "Peace Zones Established. Food Supplies Incoming After Surrender." Her throat tightened. It sounded like a lie too good to believe. But deep down, hope has its own appetite. She showed it to the others. Some laughed bitterly. "They'll poison the food," one said. Another whispered, "They'll feed us because they need workers." Nobody agreed, but everyone listened. Hunger made every possibility taste real. Across Japan, this wasn't unique. Historians later recorded that by war's end, over 60% of POWs and civilians in camps were malnourished, their rations cut to fractions of survival. In Kyushu, even soldiers were foraging for bark and insects. Yet the Americans were promising rice, canned meat, chocolate. It felt like heresy, comfort offered by the same nation that had burned their cities. That night, rain hammered the tin roofs. The women huddled together, letting the water run down their faces. It was clean, at least. Somewhere outside, the guards argued in low tones. "No more supplies," one said. "Tokyo has fallen." Another muttered something about surrender. Aiko pressed the leaflet against her chest, feeling the damp ink seep into her fingers. "Maybe," she whispered, "they're not lying this time." Her words dissolved in the rain, but the idea stayed, stubborn, dangerous, alive. By dawn, the barrel was still empty. But across the Pacific, unseen hands were already preparing parachutes packed not with bombs, but boxes of food. The War of Steel was ending. The War of Hunger had begun. August 15th, 1945. The day the air changed, it began as a whisper, static crackling through the camp's single-field radio, half buried under dust in the commandant's office. The guards gathered around it, twisting dials, smacking the metal casing as if brute force could clear the sound. The prisoners, too weak to stand, lifted their heads toward the window. They didn't know it yet, but history was about to speak through that static. Then, a voice, distant, formal, trembling. None of the women had ever heard it before, yet they recognized it instantly. It was the emperor, the man they'd only seen in portraits, the living deity of their empire, now sounded heartbreakingly human. After pondering deeply the general trends of the world, he said, "We have decided to effect a settlement." The words weren't surrender or defeat. They were softer, coded in dignity. But everyone understood. The war was over. The guards stood frozen. One dropped his rifle. Another removed his cap and covered his face. For years, they'd promised to die for him. Now he was asking them to live under their enemy's mercy. The contradiction was unbearable. Outside, the women listened through the walls, barely breathing. In that moment, the entire camp felt suspended between disbelief and relief. Some prisoners wept openly. Others stared at nothing. Ayuko pressed her ear against the bamboo wall, straining to catch every word. The radio faded in and out, the voice swallowed by static, then returning, "Endure the unendurable." The phrase hit harder than any explosion. When the broadcast ended, no one moved. The silence afterward was heavier than any air raid. For the first time, the guards didn't shout orders. The Empire's chain of command had dissolved in one radio transmission. That night, the sky above Kyushu glowed faintly from distant fires, but no bombs fell. The camp's flag hung limp. Aiko lay awake, staring at the roof, the word peace echoing in her mind, a word she'd never been allowed to use. By sunrise, the guards had vanished. Boots, rifles, and insignia were left scattered like shed skins. The women stepped outside to an empty yard, the world suddenly leaderless and terrifyingly quiet. The morning after the Emperor's voice, the camp felt like a world abandoned. No guards, no gunfire, no orders, only wind moving through bamboo and the faint creak of the empty watchtower. The flagpole still stood, but its cloth had vanished. Cut down, perhaps, by one of the fleeing officers. Aiko stepped into the yard, bare feet pressing into cold mud. Every sound felt too loud in the silence. For the first time, the women were free to move without permission. Yet freedom, after years of command, felt more like disorientation than relief. They gathered near the barracks, whispering in disbelief. Some thought it was a trick. "They'll come back," one muttered. "They want to see if we'll run." Another said, "Maybe the Americans will bomb again." Nobody truly believed peace could be this quiet. Inside the commandant's office, a few women searched through papers and found nothing but maps, empty sake bottles, and one discarded pistol. The food storeroom was bare. They tore open every crate, nothing but mold and dust. The Empire had starved them, then abandoned them. Reports from that period confirmed the chaos. After Japan's surrender, communication lines collapsed. Hundreds of POW camps went days or even weeks without orders. Many prisoners, Japanese and Allied alike, died not from violence, but from confusion, exposure, and hunger. In Kyushu, those numbers blurred into rumor. By the third day, the women began rationing rainwater, boiling shoe leather, chewing bark. Aiko wrote on the back of a discarded leaflet, "We are free, but dying." She didn't know why she wrote it, only that words felt like the only way to prove they still existed. At dusk, smoke rose in the distance, thin, white, disciplined. Not random fires, but signal smoke. Someone out there was alive, maybe even organized. The women climbed onto the barracks roof and stared. The horizon shimmered faintly, and for a heartbeat, Aiko thought she saw something move. A speck in the sky, growing larger. Engines. Distant. Faint, but real. Her breath caught. "They're coming," she whispered. The others followed her gaze, unsure whether to fear or hope. By the time the first parachutes appeared on the horizon, the silence that had smothered the camp began to break. The sound came first, low, rhythmic, unmistakable. Aircraft. The women rushed into the yard, shielding their eyes against the glaring sun. Above the broken skyline, parachutes began to bloom, white circles opening slowly against the blue. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then instinct took over. Some screamed, some fell to their knees. Others simply stared, unable to tell whether deliverance or destruction was descending from the heavens. Aiko gripped the fence, her nails digging into rust. The parachutes grew larger. Beneath them, human shapes dangled, uniformed figures drifting down with perfect calm. Allied troops, Americans, the enemy, but not as imagined. No horns, no cruelty, no guns blazing. They landed in a nearby field with military precision, their boots crunching into the dirt like punctuation marks ending a long sentence of fear. The women held their breath. The first group of soldiers approached the fence cautiously, rifles slung but pointed down. One raised a hand. His voice, amplified by the stillness, was calm and deliberate. "We're here to help. Stay where you are." The Japanese words were broken but kind. The shock was almost too much. Aiko expected shouting, punishment, humiliation. Instead, she heard gentleness. Reports show that Allied rescue teams, many from the U.S. Army's 11th Airborne Division, liberated over 100,000 POWs across Asia between August and October 1945. But statistics can't capture what it felt like in that moment. To those women, the war ended not with speeches, but with parachutes. When the gates were finally cut open, the women didn't rush forward. They hesitated, unsure how to behave in front of living symbols of their defeat. The Americans stepped through slowly, distributing rations, cans of meat, chocolate, water bottles marked U.S. property. One medic noticed Aiko trembling and offered a small tin. Inside were peaches, syrup glistening in the light. She blinked at him, speechless. He smiled and said just one word. "Eat." The sweetness hit her tongue like memory. For the first time in years, she tasted something made not from ration dust or despair. Around her, the others ate too, silently, tears mixing with syrup. The soldiers set up a medical tent near the fence, unpacking crates and blankets. For the women, it was the first sight of compassion wearing an enemy's uniform, and that changed everything. By afternoon, the camp had turned into something unrecognizable. The same yard that once echoed with shouted orders now buzzed with new sounds, canvas flapping, crates opening, English voices calling out medical terms. American medics moved quickly, turning the barracks into makeshift treatment zones. They worked with quiet urgency, not anger, not pride. To the Japanese women, this was the strangest part. Their enemies were healing them. Aiko sat under the shade of a transport tarp while a medic wrapped her infected wrist in clean gauze. The man's hands were steady, his accent thick but gentle. "Too tight?" he asked. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Every instinct in her body screamed that this was wrong. Americans were supposed to torture, not treat. Feed, not starve. Help, not harm. The contradiction short-circuited everything she thought she knew. Nearby, another soldier handed out ration tins and cigarettes. When someone offered chocolate, one woman sobbed openly, pressing the small brown bar to her lips like a sacred relic. Within hours, the Americans had distributed rice, canned peaches, water, even soap. The smell of disinfectant filled the air. Sharp, clean, alien. Reports from post-liberation records confirm that U.S. Army units distributed over 500 tons of food and medical supplies across Japan by September 1945. The GIT's goal was simple: keep everyone alive. But to these women, it felt like something deeper, a moral whiplash. Their empire had preached divine sacrifice, yet it was the enemy who gave them sugar. As night fell, some of the women gathered around a campfire, holding their new treasures, bandages, food tins, even the empty wrappers as proof the world had changed. Aiko held a small paper leaflet the medic had tucked in her hand earlier. It was the same kind that once rained from the sky, still clean, not burned. She unfolded it and read again. Surrender brings life. She whispered the words to herself. Life. Not victory. Not glory. Just life. And suddenly, the sweetness of canned peaches didn't feel like defeat anymore. It felt like permission to start over. Above them, the sky hummed faintly with the sound of distant planes, but this time, no one flinched. The enemy had become the lifeline. The women slept surrounded by boxes stamped U.S. Army. Tomorrow, they'd wake to more mercy they didn't know how to process. The leaflet the medic had handed Aiko was folded neatly, untouched by fire or rain. Its edges were crisp, its words unscarred. For her, it was more than just paper. It was proof that mercy could fall from the same sky that once burned their world. She tucked it inside her uniform pocket like a relic, not yet realizing how deeply that single sheet would carve itself into her memory. In the following days, Allied trucks arrived in convoys, delivering food, medicine, and blankets. The Americans built order from chaos, drawing chalk lines on dirt to mark supply routes. To the women, it felt like witnessing a different kind of power, one born from abundance, not dominance. The empire had promised honor through death. The enemy brought stability through logistics. The contradiction was dizzying. At dusk, Aiko sat beside the fence, watching U.S. soldiers unload crates labeled Humanitarian Relief, Pacific Operations. The noise of engines and shouted commands reminded her of bombing raids, but instead of destruction, each truck carried survival. She took out the leaflet again. Its message seemed simpler now. LiveDot reports later revealed that such psychological warfare leaflets were responsible for thousands of peaceful surrenders and prevented countless deaths by convincing civilians and soldiers alike to give up fighting. But to Aiko, these weren't statistics. They were breaths. Her friends were alive because someone, somewhere, had chosen paper instead of shrapnel. At night, a few women gathered in their barrack, candles flickering low. They spoke quietly of the leaflets, how they had once feared them, how now they represented freedom itself. Mercy came written in our enemy's language, Aiko said softly. No one contradicted her. The war had turned words into weapons, but also into bridges. One of the Americans, a young corporal from Kansas, noticed Aiko reading by candlelight and smiled. "Keep that," he said, gesturing to the leaflet. "It's history now." She nodded, though she already knew. Every wrinkle, every faded letter carried the story of a war that chose, at its end, to stop killing. Outside, the wind lifted stray leaflets that had escaped the fires, sending them tumbling across the empty yard. Paper once meant surrender. Now it meant survival. By morning, trucks lined up again to move the women out, to a processing center, to safety, to the beginning of something unfamiliar. Peace. The convoy moved the women to a coastal Allied facility, a converted warehouse surrounded by sea air and soldiers who spoke in careful, slow English. When they stepped off the trucks, the smell hit them first. Soap, bleach, salt water. It was intoxicating. After years of grime, disease, and fear, the scent of cleanliness felt unreal, almost holy. Inside, American nurses handed out folded towels, plain uniforms, and bars of white soap stamped U.S. Army Medical Corps. The women stood frozen, unsure what to do. A nurse smiled and gestured toward a row of steaming tubs. "Bath," she said simply. The word didn't need translation. Aiko was the first to step forward. The water looked impossibly clear. She sank in slowly, gasping as the warmth spread across her bones. Steam rose around her, softening the scars on her arms, lifting months of dirt from her skin. The feeling was almost violent in its gentleness. She hadn't realized how numb she'd become until now. Around her, laughter began, quiet at first, then louder, breaking like a dam. Women splashed, washed their hair, cried without shame. They watched the water turn gray as it carried away the evidence of captivity. Mirrors were propped along the far wall, fogged by steam. When Aiko finally looked, she didn't recognize the face staring back. Her cheeks were hollow, eyes too old, but they were her own again. Reports indicate that many POWs at liberation weighed 30 to 40% less than when captured. The Allies' first orders were always the same: food, medicine, sanitation. But for the women, the bath meant more than hygiene. It was symbolic rebirth. One nurse offered Aiko a comb, saying softly, "Clean means alive." Later, wrapped in fresh linens, Aiko sat by the open door, watching the sea glimmer beyond the docks. The sun was setting, gold against the ruins of a nation. She thought of the leaflet still tucked safely in her uniform pocket, its edges softened from being handled so many times. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away. The camp's barbed wire had been replaced with open gates, yet beyond them lay a new kind of captivity: uncertainty. Japan had surrendered, but what came after surrender? The question lingered as she watched American soldiers raise a new flag over the harbor. When the trucks brought them to Tokyo weeks later, the city no longer looked like a capital. It looked like a memory. Streets were reduced to lines of rubble, and the air still smelled faintly of smoke and metal. American jeeps rolled past bicycles, children, and makeshift food stalls. Every wall that still stood carried the same message in chalk or ink: "The war is over. Work for peace." Aiko stepped down from the truck, her clean uniform already coated in dust. Around her, civilians moved like ghosts, thin, quiet, rebuilding their homes brick by brick. Above them, U.S. flags fluttered beside the rising sun banners that hadn't yet been taken down. The occupation had begun. And for the first time in her life, Aiko was walking through Tokyo not as a subject of empire, but as a survivor of defeat. The Allied presence was everywhere: soldiers directing traffic, engineers repairing bridges, field kitchens handing out soup. Historians later estimated that over 300 to 50,000 Allied personnel entered Japan during the initial occupation, transforming the landscape almost overnight. To the former POWs, it felt like living in a photograph that kept developing before their eyes, every day, revealing a new layer of reality they hadn't imagined possible. Aiko found herself staring at an American truck loaded with school books and rice bags. The words U.S. Army Relief were stenciled on its side. She thought about the slogans drilled into her during training: "Better to die than surrender." Yet here was proof that surrender had kept her alive. The dissonance was dizzying. At night, she stayed in a temporary dormitory with other former prisoners. They lay awake, listening to the hum of Allied generators powering the city's first working lights in months. The electricity made the darkness feel different, not threatening, just unknown. "We lost the war," one woman murmured beside her, "but maybe not our souls." Aiko turned the leaflet over in her hands once more, its paper now yellowed, edges soft. She realized she'd stopped reading the words long ago. It wasn't what it said anymore. It was what it meant: that humanity could survive even after empire. As dawn broke over the occupied skyline, American flags caught the light. The same sun that once rose over a war machine now rose over rubble and rebuilding. And somewhere in that fragile peace, a seed of gratitude began to grow. It was 1973, and Tokyo no longer smelled like smoke. Neon signs buzzed over ramen shops, and school children hurried through crosswalks that had once been craters. Inside a quiet apartment overlooking the Sumida River, an elderly woman sat at her desk surrounded by the hum of a healed city. Aiko Nakamura was 70 now, her hair silver, her movements slow, but she still kept a single relic from the war, folded neatly inside her diary: the leaflet. Her granddaughter, Hannah discovered it one rainy afternoon while helping her clean. "Oh, Bosson," she said, unfolding the yellowed paper carefully. "What is this?" The ink had faded, but the message was still legible. "Surrender brings life." Hannah frowned. "They dropped this on you?" Aiko nodded. Her voice was soft but steady. "We were terrified. We thought it was poison." She paused, staring at the words as if seeing them again for the first time. "But this paper saved us." The girl looked confused. "Saved you? From what?" Aiko smiled faintly. "From believing everything we were told." Outside, the rain tapped against the window pane, rhythmic as memory. Aiko told her how the leaflets had fallen like snow, how everyone had screamed, how mercy had arrived disguised as fear. She didn't describe the hunger, the deaths, the chaos, just the silence afterward, the moment when paper replaced fire. Hannah listened, eyes wide. "So you forgave them?" she asked. Aiko folded the leaflet again, creasing it with practiced care. "Forgiveness isn't a gift," she said. "It's what keeps ghosts quiet." That leaflet had survived 3 decades of humidity and time, pressed flat between pages that smelled of ink and dust. Historians later collected testimonies like hers for Japan's Voices of War archive, recording how simple printed messages had changed the course of surrender. But for Aiko, the value wasn't historical. It was personal. When Hannah left that evening, Aiko placed the leaflet back in its envelope, sealing it gently. Outside, the city glowed with the light of televisions and traffic, proof that peace, though imperfect, had endured. She looked once more at the folded paper resting under her palm. "We were saved," she whispered, "by what we feared." The words hung in the air, fragile yet eternal, and somewhere deep within the night, the sound of rain began to echo like distant paper falling from the sky. August 1945 again, only this time it lives in memory. The sky over Kyushu glows faintly in black and white film reels, endless paper tumbling through the air like a snowfall of ghosts. Decades later, those moments still replay in history's quiet corners. The day the war ended, not with another bomb, but with silence written on thin sheets of mercy. Historians calculate that the Allied leaflet campaign during WWII spanned over 6 billion pieces worldwide. But numbers can't capture what it felt like to stand beneath that falling paper. Every page a question. Would you rather live or die for pride? For Aiko Nakamura and thousands like her, the answer came not through command, but through contradiction. The enemy's message had forced them to see humanity where propaganda said none existed. Footage from that era shows women clutching the leaflets as though they were fragile passports to survival. Even now, museums display them behind glass, edges singed, ink smudged, words both warning and promise. Each one carries an echo of fear transformed into understanding. Aiko's leaflet still lies folded on her desk in Tokyo, sealed in plastic to keep the ink from vanishing. When her granddaughter visits, she sometimes asks to see it. Together, they unfold the page, their fingertips brushing across history. The paper feels thin as breath. "You know," Hannah once said, "it's strange that something so soft could stop a war." Aiko smiled. "Not strange," she replied. "Necessary." Outside the window, the city hums with the life the paper once promised. Trains, voices, neon, proof that survival can bloom from surrender. Somewhere above, the same sky stretches over the Pacific, ageless and forgiving. The final image isn't fire or victory or parades. It's paper. Billions of leaflets drifting across a silent nation, the air shimmering with choices rather than destruction. The same hands that once dropped bombs now dropped warnings, and for a brief, astonishing moment, compassion flew faster than hate. Sometimes, the loudest message in war is delivered without sound. Just white sheets of paper fluttering against a dying empire's sky, asking its people to live. And long after the ashes settled, that message still falls in memory. Quiet, weightless, eternal.